What's happening, folks? Back with another reaction, back with some more video game music. And we're actually going to listen to a tune from Lost Eden, originally a computer game from 1995, though I believe a year or two later, I think 97, it came out on the Panasonic 3DO. A pretty rare and almost infamous game system, but my older brother happened to have a 3DO, so this is a game I ended up playing at the time of its release, which again was a couple years after the game had come out for PC. In any case, the reason I wanted to do this reaction, I've done one previous reaction to the soundtrack for this game by Stéphane Picq, a French composer, mainly of game music, and I think one who made game music in the 90s, including a game that was part of the Dune universe, but then eventually he retired from the music industry. I think he moved to Madagascar, but then started to make some more tunes again, and I think made a tune or a soundtrack for a game as recently as a couple years ago. But he passed away a couple months ago, which I just found out. So R.I.P. to Stéphane Picq. And we're going to listen to the Lost Eden theme, which is rendered a couple different ways. I'm going to play the version from the original soundtrack, which I think is to the PC game. But some of the tunes, including this one, were redone or slightly rendered differently for the 3DO release, so it's actually not the version I know most clearly, though it is the original version of the tune. And I've listened to them side by side or one after the other, and most of the elements are the same melodically. The only real difference is that the original version here has this ambient intro with bird sounds, and then it rolls into the intro that the 3DO version starts with. So yes, it's a very warm and inviting tune. It's a tune that in the game plays at the home citadel of the main character, and you eventually go out into these different lands and you have to make agreements with non-human species. There's dinosaurs in the game. They're not quite like the dinosaurs from the history of Earth, meaning they are sapient and they can speak different languages, though you have to learn how to talk to them and so on. Nevertheless, this track has a warm, nostalgic feel, even in the context of the game. Never mind for me and other people who may have played it and remember it positively and nostalgically in that regard. But in the game, it gives you this sense of, okay, this is home, this is where my character is safe, and I don't have to justify my presence and so on. Whereas when you go out into some other different areas, and indeed, as expressed in the musical qualities of Thaw's Secret, which is the other tune I reacted to previously from the soundtrack, there's a lot more mystery and intrigue and suspense in some of the tunes. So this one is a much calmer and more warm and inviting type of track. Let's give it a listen. This is from the Lost Eden soundtrack, the Lost Eden theme, which I think is originally from 1995, though as I said, there's a slightly updated version that came in the 3DO release of the game a couple years later. And again, even in games that were coming out in the 90s, meaning not some of the more primitive game systems, which, believe me, is not a knock. I grew up in the 80s, so the first system I ever had was an NES. But yes, even as game soundtracks got more expansive and could incorporate formal vocals and singing as we hear here, most tunes tended to still be a loop, because if you're on a given level or in a given location and you stay there for long enough, it's either the music stops and then formally starts over, which, is a bit odd, or the track rolls over on itself and the moment it hits the end, it's the first bar at the beginning again. So yes, oftentimes when there are soundtracks, you do get a fade like that, because at some point you just have to say, okay, we can imagine that this is the, this number of times repeating it, you get a sense for what the tune is. But yes, I love that ethereal, tribal, but almost pitched up type of vocal. It really has a nice melody to it, and I think it's the most memorable part of the tune. When I think of this track, that is actually the part I think of first. I didn't remember going into this the big operatic style vocal, but I think that is a very nice element too. I do like the syncopated breakbeat style percussion, and in the sections post, not chorus, but in those interludes between the sections with the vocals, it does get a bit more intense. I wouldn't necessarily say gritty, but it has a bit more drive and rugged energy to it. So I like the balance of the tune overall, though again, I think the general sentiment that it gives is a very welcoming and lush environment. And again, I think it's the Citadel of Mo, which is your character Adam, and I don't know if it's supposed to be like Adam and Eve and talking about dinosaurs. I think there might be some drawing upon both history and mythology and even religion in the choices made narratively for the game. But yes, your character Adam comes from the Citadel of Mo, the Citadel of Knowledge, and then again, I think there's some danger or some reason that you have to go out into the world and try to forge alliances with, or at least figure out the threat from these different dinosaur species. But then in multiple cases you have to go back to Mo, you have to go back to your home citadel, and so every time you go there and this tune starts, I remember when I played it as a kid, I was like, or I guess not a kid, as a teenager, I was always like, man, I just kind of want to sit here for a minute and enjoy this music now that I'm back. So yeah, it's a brilliant soundtrack. Once again, shout out and RIP to Stéphane Picq, a composer who I don't know much about other than, again, one or two other games that he made soundtracks for, which I never personally played. This is the only one I played. But as I wrote in my review on Discogs for the soundtrack now several years ago, at least a few years ago, I remember thinking, this game's cool, it's atmospheric, I like it, although I think the music is a big part of that. So I remember thinking at one point that, it's almost as if the soundtrack is too good for the game. It's a game soundtrack that should be in a game that more people know about, that has a bigger legacy, and which people regard as an all-time classic. I think Lost Eden is a good game, but it's not like something like Star Control 2 or Chrono Trigger, where more or less universally people who've known it, people who've played it, are like, oh, that's one of the best games ever. So Lost Eden, I feel like, lucked out in that it got a soundtrack that perhaps exceeds the quality of the game, even if I do think the game was compelling on some level. So yeah, as I said, RIP to Stéphane Picq. Let me know what you think of the tune. I will see you next time. Peace.